Okay, we got another white. Fine. Let's go e4. Knight f3. And we continue to play the 4-knight Scotch. Continue to play the 4-knight Scotch. So far, we've performed very well with it. And so far, we haven't faced anybody who's gone for the main line, which of course is bishop b4 in this position, or bishop c5. Most people below 1500 tend to take the knight on d4, but this is around the level. No, still knight takes d4. Not a good move, as we've discussed on several occasions, guys. Because once the queen enters the center, and a lot of people here play c5. Like, this is like incredibly common move at even 1600 and below, because it's this idea that if you attack the queen, you're doing something good. But as I've said, you have to divorce yourself from the notion that simply threatening the queen is a good idea on its own basis. It has to be doing something else. d6, though, is a better move. d6 is a nice move. This is the lesser evil because it stops us from playing e5. And here we should make an important decision about where we want to castle. Both ways of playing are totally fine. But in this game, I just feel like playing a little bit more positionally. So I feel like castling short today, which essentially means that we should start by developing this bishop. Let's castle kingside, and let's play positionally. Where should we go with the bishop on f1? Who can tell me what the most natural, the nicest square for the bishop is in such positions? Yeah, so there's two options. Bishop d3 definitely is possible, but I personally prefer bishop c4. I prefer bishop c4. Why do I say that? Because the pawn on e4 is it's protected enough times, right? It's protected already twice. You don't really need this bishop to be protecting it again. I think the bishop is doing a little bit better on this diagonal instead. Bishop b5 check would be an empty move because of c6. Bishop b5 check just runs into c6, and that we haven't gained anything. Okay, castles. Now, as for the other bishop, this is a bit of a trickier question. Because you could essentially make a case that none of the squares on this diagonal are all that great. You could play bishop g5. That's obviously a reasonable move. Nothing wrong with it. But it's, it doesn't pin the knight. Big deal, right? Bishop f4 kind of bites on granite. Bishop e3, you could say, well, that's okay, but it's a little bit bland. And it also walks into knight g4 in some situations. So is there an alternative? Like, if we don't like any of these squares, is there hypothetically something else we could do? I don't like bishop d2. It's just really passive, right? And it blocks the d file. Presumably we'll want to put a rook on d1 at some point. Let's fianchetto. Don't forget about the fianchetto. And don't feel like the fianchetto is only for the Nimzo Larsen, right? If you don't do it on move 1, you can never do it. Fianchettoing is a legitimate way of developing your pieces, of developing your bishops. Okay, bishop e6. Now, do we need to react to this? Should we take on e6, or should we simply proceed with the fianchetto? Or maybe we should drop the bishop back to d3. What do you guys think? This is a pretty slam dunk question. Yeah, we should just ignore. We definitely shouldn't trade, because that gives him more control over the center, and it gives our opponent the f-file. So bishop b2, the instinct should be to keep the tension, not to trade. The instinct should be to ignore. Rook e8. Okay. Now we have many good moves. We have a great position where we have more space, and we have a couple of approaches we can take. But the approach I like is just to keep improving our position, to make natural good moves, and ultimately to detect the moment when we should take more concrete action, as we did in the previous game. So how should we position our rooks? Well, this is, again, a very easy question. Rooks on d1 and e1 is the traditional way of playing in such positions. Let's start with rook a d1. It doesn't really matter. You could also start with the rook fe1. Obviously, we take with the queen, not with the pawn. And the moment I've taken with the queen, I've noticed that there is an x-ray against black's queen. Now, there's nothing I can do about it now, right? I've just noticed it. I made a mental note to myself just to make sure that I don't miss tactics related to that x-ray. Okay. In addition to rook fe1, we can also start pushing the f-pawn. We can definitely play f4. But again, I want to play as simple as possible this game and see where that strategy takes us. So rook fe1. And the other thing we haven't gotten a chance to do yet, which I really want to, is create some luft with the move h3. I want to create some luft. Given that there's a pretty non-zero possibility that the center opens up, you could just see that things are starting to percolate in the center. e5 has become a possible idea. It would be very, very nice if we had a little bit of luft so we didn't have to worry about it. Okay. Now this is an instructive moment, because I think a lot of you probably look at this move and say, oh no, black is heading for e5. This is something we should prevent. So perhaps we should play f4. But, in fact, we don't have to. And this is exactly the point I've been making several times here, which is that your opponent threatening your queen is not inherently dangerous. Yeah, let's imagine that black plays knight e5. You move your queen back to e2. Then you casually play f4 and chase the knight away from e5. It's really not a big deal. Really not a big deal. But f4 is good as a standalone move. I like f4. We're going to play f4. We're going to play it. But I want us to be playing this move not because it's so important to prevent knight e5, but because we're expanding on the king side. That's why we're playing that move. We're expanding on the king side. We're controlling squares. It's not because we're so afraid of knight e5. As long as we understand that, I'm fine with us playing it. Okay, now our reaction to this move is pretty... is generally to play a4 and prevent b5. And I think this is no exception. Let's try to be as prophylactic as possible. Our opponent playing well, rook c8. Okay. Well, what should we do now? f4 has already created luft. We already have a little bit of luft on f2. So we should probably start assembling our pieces in preparation for a kingside attack. So a lot of you are proposing knight c5. Not a good move, guys, because black just plays c6 and chases the knight away from d5. Common mistake, right? It's tempting to put the knight into the center, but we shouldn't do that just yet. What I prefer is a rook lift. I prefer rook lift. Either rook e3, rook g3, or rook d3, rook g3, both would have been fine. I feel like this is a little bit better, though, because I want to keep the other rook on d1 because it x-rays the queen. I want us to maintain as many tactical properties of the position as possible. Queen h4. Good move. Yeah, and this is a case in point. Now our rook on d1, which is free, and currently doesn't have an assignment, can shift over to f1 in order to guard the f4 pawn. Does that make sense? And now, in addition to playing rook g3, which is still possible, how could we... Where else could we go? What else could we do on the king side? Well, we could play rook g3. That's what our plan was initially. But notice the queen on h4, right? It's right in our face. Okay, b5. Forget everything I said. Let's focus on the move. That, I don't understand that at all. That just seems like a weird blunder of a pawn. We just take it. Okay. Knight b6. Okay, that was the idea. But again, this is not scary. It just attacks our queen. We move our queen back, and that's it. Now, where should we put our queen? This is a bit of a tricky question. I like the d3 square for two main reasons. The first is that it's a nice centralized spot for the queen, right? It's a nice spot. It's in the center, and it holds everything together. But the other reason I like queen d3, who can name the other reason? I'm noticing a potential tactical reason, which is way far in the future, but maybe not so far in the future. It's sort of staring down the h7 pawn, and you can imagine that if we go rook h3, which I think we could even play in this position, we're not, but it's something we could consider. After the queen moves, we could go e5, and then we'll have a mate threat. Now, instead, I would prefer to take on b5. Let's just secure our extra pawn, and then we'll start worrying about continuing the attack. In addition, part of the reason I took with a knight and not with a queen is that I noticed a very, very powerful maneuver that this knight could embark on. What am I talking about? Where would it go? What's the destination? And, this is a square that you should always be looking at in such positions because it's really the ideal square for the knight. I've said this before. f5. Let's go. San Francisco, Frankfurt. Frankfurt, f5 International Airport. Simple maneuver, old as the hills. We're going to f5. We're hitting g7. And here's some very important thing to understand, guys. Does g6 prevent knight f5? Does the move g6 prevent knight f5? Because I know that some of you might be worried about this prospect. The answer is obviously no, it does not. Why doesn't it? Because after g6, knight f5, G takes f5. Well, we had rook g3, and that is totally devastating. I'll show this after the game on the board. Okay, knight f5. Now, of course, d takes e4. We take the queen with check. I expected you to spot this. And that's it. The stage is set. Now it's time for decisive action. Okay, our play should be very logical here. We haven't done anything tactically crazy just yet. Queen d7. Okay. Now, there are multiple ways that we could win this game. Multiple. And there are, several tactical approaches to take here. But let's try to play in an aesthetically pleasing way and in an effective way. So, I think you guys might be a little bit overwhelmed by the abundance of tactical ideas available to us on the king side. But one very important idea to understand here is, first of all, rook g3 is the most obvious move, right? Just to get the rook to g3. And rook g3 is winning. Rook g3 is winning because after rook g3, g6, right? What can we do? What is the crushing move after g6? Knight h6 check, black can play king h8 here. Knight h6 check, black is under no obligation to take the knight. Queen d4, Jake got it. Rook g3, g6, queen d4, and the threats along the long diagonal are unstoppable. But we can take the idea of rook g3, we can convert it into something a little bit nicer. We can take it and convert it into something a little bit nicer. We can start by playing bishop takes g7. We can start by throwing in this move, and after bishop takes g7, then and only then do we go rook g3. Okay, and that's crushing because the bishop is indefensible unless he wants to give away his queen, which is fine by me. And once we get our rook to g7, the combination of the knight and the rook and the queen on d3, which is ready to swing to the king side, there is going to be a mating combination there. I haven't seen it just yet, but I trust that it exists. I trust that it exists. And I'll talk more about this after the game. If you're feeling a little confused, like what am I doing? Don't worry about it. I'll address this afterwards. So rook takes g7 check, and I'm really hoping for king f8 because it'll allow us to demonstrate a very typical but very pretty decisive combination. Which one am I referring to? Yeah, rook g8. The rook sacrificed, forcing the king onto g8. I don't know exactly what it's called, actually. This isn't really a deflection sacrifice. I guess it is a deflection sacrifice. You're forcing the king onto g8, where it will be checkmated with the queen traveling to g7. Yeah, remember this concept. This is a very classic attacking idea. Okay, simple attack. Nice ending. Let's delve into the game. So I'm going to go very quickly through the opening. Again, knight takes d4 is a mistake. We've gone over this many, many times. You guys know that bishop b4 is the traditional move, with bishop c5 being another viable way of handling this position. But d6, to our opponent's credit, is a lot better than c5, which creates massive weaknesses in the center. And c5, you might remember that our queen belongs on a4 in this position to stop d6. And now white simply threatens to play e5. Okay, so d6, we get our bishop out. Bishop e7, castles. And now we decided to fianchetto our bishop. And of course, the fact that the queen is on d4 is a big influence on this decision. Because once we get our bishop fianchettoed, we are going to have a direct x-ray onto the g7 pawn. And the moment the knight on f6 disappears, we will have, obviously, tactical ideas connected with that. Okay, so bishop e6, bishop e2, keeping the tension. Rook e8. I don't know if I fully explained why this is beneficial to black, right? There's two main reasons. The f-file is less important, right? The f-file is not occupied by either side. It's really the fact that the pawn guards the d5 square. This is what I don't like about that, right? We can really never play knight d5 again. And black also opens up space on the king side. So the rook, for instance, can move back to f8 and it can move to f7 and guard the g7 pawn against any combinations related to this battery. Right? So instead, we just improve our position. We continue improving. We play f4, not really to prevent knight e5, but just to expand. a6, a4, stopping b5. Rook c8. Welcome to rook lift land. Now rook f1 to defend the pawn on f4. And b5 is sort of panic. Our opponent panicked here. If he wanted to prepare b5, that is not a bad idea, but he should go c6. And by the way, guys, a lot of you made this mistake. Knight d5, be careful about these types of moves, right? I understand the instinct to centralize your knight is a very good one. But just make sure that you're checking to see whether your opponent can chase that knight away. You know, don't just throw a piece into the center. See if that square is stable. It's super important. If black's pawn was on c5, then obviously knight d5 would be amazing. Okay. So, takes knight b6, queen back to d3. Staring down the h7 pawn. Knight takes b5. Okay. Knight comes to d4, and this is the juiciest part of the game. So g6, we throw the knight onto f5 anyway. G takes f5, rook g3 check. This isn't mate in one. I mean, black can stave off mate with bishop g7, but you can take with either piece here. And you know what's really cool? If you take with a bishop and black takes on e4 with the queen, who can give me the mating sequence? And if you paid careful attention to how we checkmated him during the game, you should see this quickly. This is exactly the same idea, but with the bishop rather than with the knight. With the bishop rather than with the knight. Bishop f6. Yeah, and now rather than a rook on g3, we need a queen on g3 so that it can give a mate on g7. Boom. In the game, we had a knight on f5. Both of these pieces are fulfilling exactly the same role. That is, defending g7. So, similarities and patterns, you can already see that bearing fruit. So, instead, d5, knight f5, and now we are staring at this g7 pawn. Now, first thing to get out of the way, knight h6 is a bad move. And when you're attacking, you can never assume that your opponent is going to take pieces that you sacrifice. After king h8, I simply don't see a follow-up, folks. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but f7 is defended. Now your knight looks kind of dumb on h6, and you've actually helped black's king get to a safer square. That's the tragedy of this move, is that you've helped black's king move to a safer square. Even though the pawn on g7 is pinned, this pawn is not the worst pawn in the world. It's defended by the bishop. You need to maintain your knight on f5 because it pressures the g7 pawn. Okay, now the second idea is to play rook g3. This is to complete the rook left. And after g6, I mentioned that queen d4 is winning. And it is. It creates totally crushing threats. Queen h8 is mate. f6. Queen takes f6. Resignable. But there's this idea of sort of changing up the move order, right? You can take on g7 first, and then get the rook to g3. And then get the rook to g3. And I'm sure that I could even find games with this kind of idea. Like you sack on g7 first, and then you complete the rook left. Let me see if I can dig up an example here. In this position, not famous players, but correspondents. What do you think white started with? And it's a slightly different version of the combination. Don't just try to, like, you know, one for one this. Like, that's the whole point. That's why chess is a hard game. Now, you might notice that the rook on e1 is attacked, but white ignores that threat and creates a much stronger threat. Instead of moving this rook passively to e2, white plays bishop takes h6. Black dutifully grabs the rook on e1, and here white applies the concept we have just talked about. Right? A lot of you would be tempted to go knight f5 here, but if you go knight f5 immediately, black goes g6 and black defends. So you have to change up the order of operations. What should you do first? What did white do first before going knight f5? Right, this exact same concept. First you take on g7, and then you go knight f5. Right, and now black can't stop the rook from infiltrating to g7. The best that black can do here to avoid getting checkmated. And just like in our game, he could have gotten checkmated like this. Right, this is exactly how we finished the game. But in this game, black correctly played queen f6. Essentially giving up the queen, but this is completely winning for white. White has this queen and knight pair. The other knight's coming out to f5, and white just has a gazillion extra pawns. And black has a wide open king. White went on to win in about 20 more moves. The rest of the game is not interesting. Another example. This is a Swedish GM, Brunel. Game of Swedish GM. This position. Okay, so you can see some of the elements in common, right? Notice the elements that are in common with our game. What do you see? Well, you might notice that there's a knight on d4, right? You might notice that there's a rook on d3. There's a bishop on f4. Queen on e2, right? White's assembled all these pieces and they all aim at the king side. So you look at this for a couple of seconds, and the first move that comes to mind to me is to complete the rook lift with rook g3. But as we already know, here black can make the move g6, and this bishop on f8 can try to reposition to g7, and black can try his best to hold on for dear life. But white makes an incredibly smart move here. It's a tactic. It's pretty simple. Who sees it? What does white start with? What does white start with here? Doesn't start with rook g3. He doesn't start with knight f5. He starts with bishop takes h6 straight away. The point is that if g takes h6, you give a check, and black is busted, because if you cover with the bishop, then of course knight f5 is winning, but queen g4 is mating. And queen g4 is also what happens after king h8. This is just so one-sided. I mean, look at this. Queen g8 is the mate threat, and if you move the bishop, then you relinquish the g7 square. Common occurrence. So black goes d6, tries his best to distract him. White's not distracted. Rook g3, de. And now we already know the drill. Knight f5 allows g6. Therefore, bishop takes g7 first, then knight f5, and that's it. Rook takes g7 is coming. Black had to go f6 and give up the queen, but the game lasted only 5 more moves. So, important attacking concept, motif, whatever you want to call it. But it is. And very similar to what we do. Bishop takes g7. Now it should make a lot more sense, hopefully. Now that you've seen these examples, rook g3, and we're gonna. Now black could have played f6 and probably should have played f6, just like that 2300 did, and very similar kind of thing where we're up a queen and a million pawns, and this is an easy win. Right? Don't be afraid to convert your attack into a big material advantage. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. That often is the best way to continue against best defense. Yeah, knight g7 also possible. Also very much possible. I think probably an alternative. But I think the knight on f5 is just a better attacker in general than the bishop. No, I looked these games up. Yeah, and if king h8, this was more resilient of a defensive move. Oh my god, but we have a gorgeous mating sequence here. Who sees it? Oh my god, this would have been even nicer. This would have been such a nice way to end the game. Now, a lot of you are probably noticing queen h3. Not the best move. Because black can hold on with queen takes f5. And of course, black is totally lost here, but the game goes on. Instead you take on h7. Then you play queen h3. Now, if the king drops back, then everything is easy. Right? Queen g4, queen g7 is mate. This is easy. What about king g6? Because now if you play queen g4, the king, I'm not sure there's mate here. The king escapes through f6 to e6. But we have a really, really nice idea. Let's play queen h6. King takes f5, g4. Keep forcing the king further and further down the primrose path, and now queen g5, queen g3 is mate. I mean, isn't that nice? King ends up on h3. That's just what happens when you have the right attacking ingredients in place. When you have such an abundance of attackers, you can afford to sack most, if not all of them, and still deliver checkmate. Oh yeah, queen g5, queen e5 is even faster. Very good catch. Even faster. Queen g5, queen e5. And perhaps even nicer, mate in the center of the board. Beautiful. Also mate. Awesome stuff. Good catch. Okay, well that would have been even nicer, but our opponent... I didn't see that during the game. I only saw that just now. He played king f8, but now rook g8 is winning. Okay, that was a nice attack. That was one of the first times we really won a game with a sustained attack that lasted more than 2 or 3 moves. Notice the ingredients. We started by lifting our rook up. We patiently assembled our pieces. We used a maneuver to get our knight to an ideal square. And then when we had the pieces locked in place, we looked for concrete sacrifices and ideas. Okay, I think this is a great spot to end. We went a little bit longer than expected, but now it's time for me to go to bed. All right, guys. Thank you for hanging out and everybody for the support. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everybody.